Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a moment with our presentation today. I'm gonna wait a few more moments, people trickle in. I now have 6:02, and so we'll get started today with our presentation. Welcome to this presentation, A House Divided Southern Jews During the Civil War, with the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience and the Shapell Roster of Jewish Service in the American Civil War. We're going to have about a 50-minute presentation today with Anna Tucker from the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience and Alex Apito and Caitlin Winkler from the Shapell Roster of Jewish Service in the American Civil War. And then we'll have an opportunity for questions. If questions come up during the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll read them out at the end. And with that, I'm gonna send it off to Anna, Alex, and Caitlin for our presentation.
All right, wonderful. Good evening, everyone. As Lizzie said, my name is Anna Tucker. I'm curator at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. So if you can you wave in your camera if you visited the museum before? All right, I'm seeing a fair number of people waving their hands. So for those of you who have not yet visited us here in New Orleans, we cover about 350 years of history across 13 states. So we range from everything from Joachim Gans, who in 1585 became the first known Jew to set foot in what would later become the United States, all the way up to present day with one of our recently donated artifacts, which is a Ruth Bader Ginsburg float that was donated by Crew de Michigas, a Jewish trading group here in New Orleans. So we really explored the history, the culture, the politics, and the religion of Jewish communities throughout the American South. Many of these stories are stories of inclusion, of building communities, of coming together. However, we also talk about the hard points of history, of exclusion, of division as well. So as we curated the opening exhibitions of the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, we knew that a very important story that we needed to tell is the story of Jewish experiences in the South during the Civil War. So if we can go on to the next slide, what you're about to see here on your screen is our section named Navigating Southern Spaces. So in this section, we talk about the Civil War, we talk about slavery, and we share perspectives of Jewish Southerners during this time period. And we really share a diverse set of perspectives, everyone from privates all the way up to very well-known individuals like Judah P. Benjamin, who we'll hear a little bit more about tonight. And before we dive into the artifacts that we have on display and some of the content, I want to acknowledge the incredible guidance that we've had from our historical advisory committee. And that also includes some of our friends here from Shapell Manuscript Foundation, who were really instrumental in building out the narrative and also the facts of this time period. I'd also like to give a shout out to Robert Marcus, who I believe is on this presentation tonight, to thank him for donating the vast majority of the artifacts that we have from the Civil War. He also provided source material for our Magic Lantern display, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And I know from my conversations with the Shapell Manuscript Foundation that he was also instrumental in working with them on these narratives of Jewish experiences during the Civil War. So on that introductory note, I would love to pass it over to the Shapell Manuscript Foundation to talk a little bit more about the incredible research that they're doing.
Hi, everyone. For those of you not familiar with the organization behind our project, the Shapell Manuscript Foundation is based in Israel with additional offices in California. and dedicated to collecting and exhibiting 19th and 20th century manuscripts and documents with a focus on unique themes in US history and the Holy Land. The foundation has many projects in development, one of which is the Shapell Roster of Jewish Service in the American Civil War. Pictured here are some pre-COVID exhibitions and publications that are currently available. And if you'd like to know more about the foundation, please visit our website. And before we tell you about our research, as Anna was just saying, we really want to recognize the research of Bob Marcus, who I believe is in the audience today. I hope. Hi, Bob. The Shapell Roster exists today thanks to Bob's efforts to update Simon Wolf's The American Jew as patriot, soldier, and citizen. He spent decades before the internet existed gathering clues and leads and continues to do so today. 10 years ago, Bob passed the torch to us, and the Shapell Roster of Jewish Service in the American Civil War was born. To date, we've discovered and added more than 800 Union soldiers, not included in Wolf's accounting. Using historical and genealogical research, we've identified almost the same number of Union names from Wolf that are not Jewish. This is not surprising, given that he employed the 19th century accepted practice of name profiling. On the Confederate side, so far we've uncovered 486 soldiers Wolf missed, and we've barely scratched the surface. To be entered into our database, a soldier or sailor must have served in the US or Confederate military between April 12, 1861 and May 9, 1865, the start and end dates of the Civil War, and must have documented evidence that the soldier was Jewish by genealogy, by self-identification, or identification by his peers. Whereas Wolf's roster stuck to the usual military basics like name, rank, and regiment, the data we collect on our soldiers includes date and location for birth and death, a detailed accounting of his military service, marriage, residence, and occupation details, the connections, if any, between him and the other individuals in the database, and historical documents that provide insight into their lives before, during, and after the war. To collect all this data, we access information from thousands of government, military, and genealogical sources with an emphasis on primary source documents. Our database will be a free to the public resource. The Union records in our database will be going live later this year. We're very excited. And we're currently knee-deep in researching the Confederates. Right now, you can check out our website, read some fascinating stories about some of the Jewish soldiers and sailors we've researched, and watch some of our previous presentations on specific Civil War soldiers and topics. If you have a Civil War ancestor or are researching a Jewish soldier or sailor, please reach out now. If we already have your soldier in our database, we'd love to share the documents and information that we found with you. If we don't have your ancestors, we hope you'll give us their names and we'll review and scan their military records for you. Either way, we want to talk to you and build the most complete histories for these soldiers. So while we're still in the middle of our work for the Confederacy, we want to give you a little sneak peek at the kind of information that we collect and the kind of statistics and analysis that the roster data enables. The first two states that we've tackled in the South are Louisiana and South Carolina. Because new names come to us every day from all corners and our numbers change all the time, we never truly finish working on a state. But we have reviewed all of the names included in Simon Wolf's roster for both the state of Louisiana and South Carolina, as well as undertaken a lot of additional research for both states. So we're going to show you the numbers as they stand today. So far, we have confirmed 208 Jewish soldiers that served in South Carolina regiments. Of these, 87 are new discoveries made by the roster team. As you can see on the right side of your screen, as an example of the kinds of data comparison possible with the roster, we have a breakdown of Jewish South Carolina soldiers by place of birth. 46.2% of these soldiers were born in the US, 25% were born outside the US, and 28.8% of these soldiers do not have a place of birth that we've been able to identify in the historical records currently available to us. For Louisiana, so far, we have confirmed 270 Jewish soldiers served in Confederate Louisiana regiments. We also have 6 Jewish soldiers that served in Union Louisiana regiments, since the state fielded regiments for both sides after the capture of New Orleans. 163 of these soldiers, over half, are new discoveries by the Shapell roster. In the pie chart on your left, you can see a different trend emerging. Unlike South Carolina, the majority of our Louisiana soldiers, 67.3% of them, were born outside of the US, with 27.2% being US natives and 5.5% having an unidentified place of birth. This is likely because at the time, New Orleans was a huge immigration hub, with new immigrants arriving in the port there every day. As a comparison, only 17.8% of Jewish soldiers and sailors serving for the Union were native born. We are excited that statistics like these are possible to obtain with the roster search functions. We look forward to sharing more statistics on our website with you when more data becomes available. I'm now going to throw it over to the museum, and Anna is going to tell you about some of the museum's fascinating Civil War era objects.
All right, thank you, Alex. So I wanted to begin today with artifacts that might seem familiar, or at least the names might seem familiar to you. So the way that we'll structure it, we'll start with a very narrow focus of the artifacts themselves, then step back just a bit to look a little bit more at the people, and then Shapell will be able to put these artifacts into context. So what you see on your screen right now are artifacts representing what to many is the face of the Southern Jewish experience during the Civil War, Judah P. Benjamin. Before I go into a brief overview about Judah P. Benjamin, I'd like to talk about the artifacts that we have related to him. And these are courtesy of, again, Robert Marcus. So what you see on your screen is a loan bond and then two notes or bills that depict Judah P. Benjamin. So on the left-hand side is a bond, and it's actually quite sizable. So it's right around 14 inches by 14 inches. And it was issued on December 23rd, 1862, with Richmond as being the identifying location. So it's made from paper, which you can see on your screen, but maybe what's not quite as noticeable is how thin the paper is. It's likely a rice paper. And you might be able to tell as well that both the bonds and the bill notes are hand cut. So there wasn't necessarily the machinery that was being used. So you see a lot of sort of gaps, and there's not completely straight lines around these bills. So the loan on the left-hand side is for $1,000, and on the bottom you can see that it was meant to mature in increments of about exactly $40 up until 1880. Now, Judah P. Benjamin was not the only face on these bonds or on these loans, but he was also represented on the $500 bond loan as well. On the right, we see two $2 bills on display. Now, these were also going to be a little bit higher in terms of circulation than you see the bill or the bonds. And the $2 bills are something that displayed Judah P. Benjamin throughout its circulation. So from 1862 until 1864, which is on the bottom. Now, not all Confederate notes depicted both scenes of individuals and some of the artistic scenes that you see on the bottom here, but sometimes they did. On the top bill, which is the second $2 bill that was produced, depicting Benjamin, shows a design that's been termed the South striking down the Union. And I apologize, I just realized I have these two notes swapped on the PowerPoint. So if we look at the bottom bill, that is actually the earlier bill from 1862 that depicts the design termed as the South striking down the Union. The upper $2 bill is actually what I believe is the very last $2 bill issued in the $2 bill circulation, which was in February of 1864. And this only depicts Judah P. Benjamin. It was not the most popular note that was in circulation. However, the bottom bill, which is the earlier bill, had over 1.5 million in that were issues for that specific run. So for many, Judah P. Benjamin, who was a Southern Jew, was a familiar face during the Civil War in the South. Now, a little bit of background about Judah P. Benjamin, if we can go on to the next slide. So he was born in 1811 to Sephardic parents, at least one of whom is Sephardic, and he was born in the West Indies, which is today the Virgin Islands. He and his family immigrated to America, and eventually, when he was still very young, at the age of 2, settled in Charleston. Now, Benjamin attended Yale, but what is interesting is he was actually expelled following an investigation into what was termed ungentlemanly misconduct. He moved to Louisiana, however, and eventually passed the bar. He became a very prosperous and prominent lawyer at this time period. And eventually in 1852, he was elected to the US Senate, and he was sworn in 1853. And he held this position until he resigned when Louisiana seceded from the Union. He is often considered Jefferson Davis's right-hand man, and very much so was a key strategist in the construction of the Confederacy. In the middle of these three images, at the very top, I know it might be a little bit hard to see, but you actually see Judah P. Benjamin featured with quite a level of prominence in what was considered the Confederate chieftains. Now, as the Confederacy developed, he was appointed as the first Attorney General of the Confederacy, and then the Secretary of War, and then the Secretary of State. So as you can see, there was quite a meteoric rise for him within the Confederacy. Now, after the Civil War, he flees the country. He eventually settles in England, where he's a barrister. And I realize I'm going very quickly through Judah P. Benjamin's life. There is a considerable amount of scholarship that's been written about Judah P. Benjamin, including a very recent book by James Traub about Judah P. Benjamin. But one of the things that I do want to discuss is, as we talk about his political career, it's also very important that we talk about his role in slavery as well. So he was co-owner of Belle Chase Plantation, which is located in Louisiana, with upwards of 140 to 150 enslaved individuals. He eventually sold Belle Chase, or rather his share in Belle Chase Plantation, in 1852. And what you see on the right of the screen is a poster for the sale of Belle Chase by undisclosed sellers in 1852. This is actually courtesy of the National Library of Scotland. And on this document, that actually goes much longer than you see in this image right here, what's shown on this document are the identification for 129 enslaved individuals. These include Asa, age 33, Caesar, age 55, Tom Fulcher, who is a blacksmith, age 45, Hetty, age 22, Holly, age 12, Squire, age 70, and then 26 unnamed children under the age of 10. So again, as we discussed Judah P. Benjamin, he had a prominent role within the Confederacy. And there's a large amount of themes and facts and data that we can discuss related to Judah P. Benjamin. But one of the reasons we wanted to talk about him today is there is actually another Benjamin who fought for, or rather supported the Confederacy, that Shapell is actually going to dig into a little bit deeper.
So Judah P. Benjamin, as Anna was just saying, is such a looming figure within the Confederacy. So it's a little odd that most forget to mention that he had a brother, including Simon Wolfe. While Wolfe actually added Judah to the Civil War section of his book, despite Judah not actually being a soldier, he omitted Joseph P. Benjamin completely. Joseph was a captain in the 1st Louisiana Cavalry, who then recruited his own independent company of cavalry in Alexandria, Louisiana, which served as headquarters guard for the District of West Louisiana. 15 years Judah's junior, Joseph was born in South Carolina, but moved to New Orleans after graduating from the University of North Carolina and owned a plantation on the Black River in Catahoula Parish. After the war, neither Benjamin brother could recover from the South's loss, and rather than remaining in the reunified states, both fled the US and set up lives elsewhere, each returning to their pre-war professions. Judah resumed his law career and became a successful barrister in England, while Joseph ran a large coffee and fruit plantation in Honduras. And we also wanted to talk about Lionel L Levy. He was a nephew of the Benjamin brothers, the son of their sister Rebecca. A theme that is going to emerge as we continue discussing soldiers through this presentation is that the Confederacy was, in fact, a family affair. Brothers, fathers and sons, cousins, and nephews all served, and sometimes served together for the South. While we see some family service in the Union, it's nothing like the sprawling family trees and spider webs of connections we've discovered for the Confederates. This pattern seems to come from, in part, Jews living in smaller towns with deeper community ties and larger stakes in the outcome of the war. We will discuss these themes further, but also know we will learn a lot more as we continue our research for the Confederacy. So back to Lionel. Only 2 years younger than Joseph, Lionel's father, Abraham Levy, died when Lionel was only a year old. He and his mother, Rebecca, moved to Louisiana with the rest of the Benjamin family in 1847, and Rebecca played hostess and lady of the house for Judah at both his estate home, the Belle Chase Plantation, pictured here, and in Plaquemines Parish at his city house in New Orleans. Lionel, like Joseph, graduated from Chapel Hill and studied law under Judah in New Orleans. During the war, he enlisted as a private in the 5th Company, Washington Artillery, and then was recruited to put his legal skills to good use for the Confederacy. He was granted a commission as captain and judge advocate in the Provisional Army of the Confederate States. Perhaps less wounded by the Confederacy's loss than his uncles, Lionel remained in New Orleans after the Civil War. He formed a law practice with Judge John B. Cotton, a longtime Democrat and former attorney for the city of New Orleans, who was also, in spite of his political affiliations, an ardent supporter of Reconstruction efforts after the war. Lionel also became Cotton's son-in-law when he married the judge's stepdaughter, Miriam. Lionel was a popular member of society in New Orleans until his death, and Benjamin Franklin Jonas, who we will discuss a little later, served as one of the pallbearers at Lionel's funeral. And I'm going to throw it back to Anna.
All right, thank you, Alex. So the next artifact that we wanted to look at is another bill, but this one has a slightly different history. This is, as you can see, a $10 Confederate bill, and I believe it's the very last known $10 bill printed by the Confederacy in February 1864. So what is interesting, this is actually the reverse of the note, is on the back, and it is hard to see, is a red stamp. And the text on it is a poem that's written by Sidney Jonas, whom you'll hear a little bit more about in just a moment. Jonas wrote this poem at the very end of the Civil War while he was still in the Confederacy. The first iterations of this poem were actually handwritten and became so popular that it eventually became stamped and circulated on notes throughout the South. It eventually became known as lines on the back of a Confederate note. It actually has a considerable amount of cultural influence in the history and memory of the Civil War period. It became so popular that Margaret Mitchell actually quotes it in Gone with the Wind. So you can see on the right-hand side are a few different stanzas that are part of this poem itself. I will note there are a couple of changes, tenses, and a word here or two in Margaret Mitchell's depiction of this poem. She also does not attribute it to Jonas, perhaps unsurprisingly. It's not indicated on the note who wrote it, but it does show how a Southern Jew actually became a cultural voice that lasted through the decades. Now, what we'll probably consider is someone who became such a voice of Confederate culture after the war might have very deep and long-lasting roots in the South. But as we'll see on this next slide, that's not necessarily so. So what we have here on the right-hand side is a detailed depiction of the Abraham Lincoln-Stephen Douglas debate in Quincy, Illinois in 1858. So Sidney Jonas, the author of the poem on the previous slide, his father, Abraham Jonas, actually organized this debate, and he became a very close friend of Abraham Lincoln. On the left-hand side, you can see our magic lantern display, where we actually rotate through reproduction magic lantern slides that are courtesy of Robert Marcus, and talk a little bit more about some of these individual stories. So as you see, Sidney Jonas became a cultural voice of the South following the Civil War, but he actually was the son of a man who was close friends with Abraham Lincoln. So now, again, I'll pass it back to Alex and Eliza to talk a little bit about this family, which is truly a house divided during the Civil War.
So the Jonas family is not just a classic example of brother versus brother, but also uncle versus nephew, cousin versus cousin, etc. Abraham Jonas had 6 sons fight for the Civil War, as well as his brother and nephew. Additionally, his daughter and niece would marry 2 Jewish Confederate veterans after the war. While Abraham had been living in Quincy, Illinois for decades when the Civil War began, a large portion of his family had moved south to seek their fortune prior to war's outbreak. Abraham claimed his sons were, quote, compelled to join the rebel army by their adoptive states, although whether this was a father's wishful thinking or the reality of the Confederate draft and pressures to serve is up for debate. Incorrectly listed as Samuel in Malcolm Stern's First American Jewish Families, Sidney Alroy Jonas, our resident poet, was the first in the family to enlist. Sidney was working as a civil engineer for the railroad in Mississippi when the war broke out. In July 1861, he quit his job and enlisted in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, where he was appointed Major and Chief Commissary of Subsistence. He was at several famous battles, including First Manassas and Chickamauga, and was at the headquarters of Lee's Corps when General Joseph E. Johnson surrendered the camp to General William Sherman in April 1865. Next to enlist was the youngest of Abraham's children, Edward Jonas. He was only 17 when he enlisted as a private in the 50th Illinois Infantry. As a minor, Edward had his father endorse his enlistment contract, so we know Abraham supported his youngest's decision to serve for the Union. Edward was captured at the Battle of Shiloh and was freed in a prisoner exchange in Virginia in 1862. When he rejoined his regiment, Edward rose through the ranks. He received a commission to second lieutenant and served as aide de camp, and later he was granted a post-discharge promotions to brevet major and brevet lieutenant colonel for meritorious service. Julian J. Jonas was next in the family to join up, starting a throng of Jonas enlistments in March 1862. Important to note is that the first Confederate draft did not begin until April 1862. So while societal pressures may have pushed these family members into a cause they might not otherwise have chosen, they did volunteer to serve for the Confederacy. They were not forced to. Julian enlisted as a private in the Crescent Regiment, Louisiana Infantry. He was promoted to 5th Sergeant, then Quartermaster Sergeant, but ultimately reduced to private and transferred to the Louisiana Cavalry. Often discussed in Jonas family mythology is the story of Edward and Julian facing each other at the Battle of Shiloh in a literal brother versus brother showdown. While there is no record confirming that the two actually met on the battlefield, we are happy for once to get to support a myth instead of busting it. Cross-referencing regimental histories and each soldier's personal service history, it seems that when Edward was captured during the battle, Julian's Crescent Regiment was truly a mere 460 feet away. Abraham's nephew, Lewin Henry Cohen, enlisted in March 1862, as did Abraham's brother, George B. Jonas. Lewin enlisted in the Confederate Louisiana Crescent Regiment with Julian, then received a commission in the Provisional Army of the Confederate States as an assistant surgeon in December of 1862. As such, he served with multiple regiments from Louisiana, Tennessee, and Mississippi, and was also assigned to work in different military hospitals. George joined a local Louisiana militia unit, the Confederate Guards, which was assigned to the local defense of the city of New Orleans. Future U.S. Senator from Louisiana, Benjamin Franklin Jonas, known as Frank, enlisted in September 1862 in Fenner's Battery, Louisiana Light Artillery as a private. Because of the time frame, it is unclear whether he volunteered or was drafted. He saw action in Jackson in 1862 and participated in the particularly grisly campaign of Atlanta in 1863, serving until the end of the war, where he surrendered with his unit nearly a month after Appomattox, having been promoted to sergeant major. The eldest of the brothers, Charles Henry Jonas, was either last or the second to last family member to join the war effort. In October 1862, he received a commission as captain and assistant quartermaster of the Confederate 12th Arkansas Infantry. But he did not officially enter service until January 1863. 6 months later, he was captured at the Battle of Port Hudson. In May of 1864, Charles was still in Union custody while his father Abraham lay on his deathbed. President Lincoln issued a personal order granting Charles a special parole for 3 weeks to visit his father. A few hours after Charles arrived, Abraham Jonas died. Charles honored his father and Lincoln's friendship by dutifully returning to prison. Records at the National Archives reflect he was finally freed in a prisoner exchange in March of 1865. A sixth son of Abraham Jonas often gets forgotten when discussing the family during the Civil War. George B. Jonas, named for his uncle, I'm not repeating myself, like Joseph Benjamin, was omitted from Simon Wolfe's accounting of Jewish soldiers, perhaps because of the mysteries that surrounds his service. According to George, his siblings, he was the last of them to enlist, enrolling in the 10th New York Heavy Artillery in 1864 as a private, joining his brother Edward in defending the Union. But was George always loyal to the Union? On the 1890 veteran census, he stated that he served in the military from 1862 to 1865, leaving some 2 years of service unaccounted for. The muster rolls of the Confederate Guards, Louisiana militia, includes not one, but 2 George B. Jonases in their ranks. One, of course, is Uncle George, serving in Company K of the Guards. But the rolls also show a different George Jonas serving in Company B. This Confederate service could account for the additional years reported by George the Younger on the veteran census. An affidavit submitted by brother Edward for George's pension claim almost corroborates the earlier service, stating George, quote, left New Orleans for New York to enlist, confirming that George was in New Orleans at the right time to have served in this local militia. But Edward also stated in the same affidavit that George never served in the Confederate Army. Of course, if George did serve for the Confederacy, that potentially voided his Union pension claim. So there was motivation for Edward to fudge the truth. Moreover, when George enlisted with the Union in 1864, he claimed to be from Canada, perhaps to shroud his ties to the famous Jonas family and avoid detection as a former Confederate. If you'd like to learn more about the Jonas brothers during the Civil War, please read the soldier story on our website. And if you want to learn more about Abraham Jonas and his ties to President Lincoln, please check out Lincoln and the Jews by Benjamin Shapell and Jonathan Sarna.
Thank you so much. I think that is such an excellent example of how a lot of the artifacts and the stories just barely scratch the surface of the layers of history, the different perspectives that we can go into. So if you come to visit the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, you'll be able to see the actual bill with the poem from Sidney Jonas, and now you'll also have that additional history that's been overlaid by Shapell Manuscript Foundation. So now what we have on our screen is one of the most important primary sources that is available to us, and that comes in the form of diaries and journals. Not only do diaries and journals provide perspectives on larger events, so troop movements, communications, but it also provides how people were interpreting these events as they unfolded, as they came about. What I also find very interesting is you start seeing people's personal lives interwoven through diaries and journals that you wouldn't necessarily see in official communications that were sent between different individuals. So we are indebted to the Ida Pearl and Joseph Cuba Archives for Southern Jewish History, which is located at the William Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum in Atlanta, because they have allowed us to display on loan one of Simon Mayer's diaries. So some of you might be familiar with the Simon Mayer diary that was from July of 1862 to July of 1863 that is held by the American Jewish Archives. They've done a wonderful job of interpreting it and preserving it as well. What we have on display at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience is actually the next edition of the diary. So it's the 1863 until 1865 notes. And to our knowledge, it has never been displayed before at a public exhibition or at a museum. So as far as we know, this diary really provides some interesting insights. Now, the information within the diary has been transcribed and collected, and it's been studied as well. But one of the interesting things that is interwoven throughout all of this are some specific sort of indications of religious life or holiday observance. Now, Simon Mayer, you will hear a good bit about him, or a fair amount about him after this. But he was very influential and instrumental in several campaigns. He had extensive movement throughout the Civil War as well. But the things that I actually wanted to highlight are some of the more personal anecdotes that he mentioned. So on the left-hand side, you can see a few quotes that I pulled. And these quotes are both from the 1862 to 1863 diary, as well as the 1863 to 1865 diary that you see here. On the top right-hand side, you see him remark that Christmas passed off very dull, although had eggnog and turkey stuffed with oysters. So this is an interesting note that you might not have expected to see from a Southern Jew. However, I do want to address a comment that I saw in the chat. I know I'm not supposed to look at questions quite yet, but it was a question about how some of the Confederate soldiers would keep kosher while in the Confederacy. And I think that this provides an interesting insight that not everyone was able to. Or not everyone chose to or elected to do so. So here we see Simon Mayer. It seems that he at least says that there are turkey stuffed oysters. We don't know if he consumed them or not, but it is something that he was around. There is another section of the museum where we note other full quotes from diaries and journals. And if you'll forgive me from reading from my notes for just a moment, Confederate soldier Isaac Levy wrote in a letter to his sister in April 1864, which was just 3 months before he was killed in battle. He said, "In Charleston, my brother purchased matzah sufficient to last us for the week. We are observing the festival in a truly Orthodox style." So you see from these two quotes that are pulled from Southern Jewish diaries, we have someone who is observing sort of an Orthodox, a very kosher Passover. And then we also see someone who is observing Christmas with turkey stuffed with oysters. Now, something else that I did want to note as well, that Simon Mayer actually talks about attending church services. There's one particular note where he says, on the 14th, went to church to hear Reverend Dr. Palmer of New Orleans. It was a real treat to be spellbound, as I was by the elaborate command which he has of words, and it was really a, quote, feast of reason and a flow of soul. Now, you might at this point start wondering, okay, we have Christmas, we have attending a church. Maybe Simon Mayer, even though he was born to Jewish parents in New Orleans and later moved to Natchez, maybe Simon Mayer converted to Christianity. And so as we were preparing for this, we actually did a little bit of a deeper dive into Simon Mayer. And in his obituary, which you will hear the details about in just a moment, he is actually listed upon his death in 1905 that he had served as president of Congregation B'nai Israel in Natchez, Mississippi. And he was also the secretary of B'nai B'rith as well. So we see someone who's actually very active in Jewish observance and Jewish institutional life. So one of the interesting things is when you can start seeing connections in the collection. What you see on the screen, and I apologize for the quality of the image, but what we have is the 1872 dedication program for, at the time, it was called just the Jewish Temple, but it was of Natchez, Mississippi. Later, it would come to be called Congregation B'nai Israel. This is the same congregation that Simon Mayer would eventually become the president of. And so he was involved with this congregation. He moved to back to Natchez, Mississippi after the Civil War. So he was involved with this congregation during the dedication of what was known as the Jewish Temple. Here's where it also gets a little bit more interesting. If you can see on the right-hand side, about midway down on the dedication ceremony list, the benediction is provided by Reverend Dr. Lilienthal. This is Rabbi Max Lilienthal of Cincinnati, who was a noted abolitionist during the Civil War. He was very much in support of the abolition of slavery. So what we have here is Simon Mayer, who fought for the Confederacy, was part of a congregation that just a few years later would be welcoming Rabbi Lilienthal to give the benediction during the dedication ceremonies. So again, I think it's very interesting to see how there are different perspectives of the Southern Jewish experience, and also ways that we don't know how Simon Mayer reacted to this. We don't have any diaries or letters. If you do have some, we'd love to hear about it. But it is interesting to see how this Natchez, Mississippi community was composed of people with very diverse perspectives at this time period. So now I will pass it back over to the Shapell Manuscript Foundation to give a little bit of a deeper dive about, okay, who is this Simon Mayer that we've been talking about?
Thanks. Born in New Orleans, diarist Simon Mayer moved to Natchez, Mississippi at age 7 and was working as a shoe salesman with his father when the war broke out. He first enlisted as a private in the 1st Mississippi Infantry. He then re-enlisted in the 10th Mississippi Infantry in March 1862, where he was detached as a clerk to brigade headquarters on several occasions, and then made acting assistant adjutant general. His ability to read and write making Mayer a valuable and necessary asset to his regiment. After multiple recommendations that Mayer be officially made an officer, he finally received a commission as first lieutenant in the new 9th Mississippi Infantry on April 8th, 1865. The day before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Mayer's regiment had held out past Lee, continuing to fight in the campaign of the Carolinas until April 26th, when General Joseph Johnson surrendered unconditionally to Sherman. Mayer was paroled May 1st at Greensboro, North Carolina. After his parole, Mayer returned to Natchez and ran a successful insurance business. He was also the president of his synagogue, Congregation B'nai Israel, and a popular member of Natchez Society. Known as Major Simon Mayer, he received the commission he tried so hard for during the war, either through the United Confederate Veterans or by popular demand. Also, in this obituary, he's a general. A lot of Confederate veterans received upgrades in rank vis-a-vis enhanced service histories, sometimes created by themselves and sometimes by local lore. Check the obits in the 1880s and 1890s for any small Southern town, and you'll be sure to find a few dozen colonels and majors running around, even though the area could only support a company or two of a regiment. Mayer met a tragic end because of an odd and possibly PTSD-related habit of sleeping with a gun under his pillow. It was believed he accidentally discharged his pistol when he fell out of bed. Simon Mayer mentions a Simon Layman in his diary. Layman was a cousin of Mayer's on his father's side. Mayer's father was born in Landau, Bavaria as Meyer Levy. He immigrated to the United States as a young man and adopted the name of John Mayer. He later helped his sister, Julia Levy Layman, and his brother, Joseph Levy, and their families get to America. Simon Layman was Julia's oldest son. On the 1860 census, Layman was living with the Mayer family in Natchez and working as a clerk alongside Simon Mayer. While Layman did not enlist with Simon Mayer in 1861, he did join the 10th Mississippi Infantry 5 months after Mayer did and served past the bitter end, like Mayer, until they were paroled together in May 1865. Layman, too, like Mayer, was singled out for his ability to read and write and spent on special assignments as a clerk. At one point, he was detached as a clerk to the chief surgeon of his brigade. After the war, Layman returned to Natchez and then bounced around different Southern towns, working in retail stores until his death in Memphis in 1908. Layman had not been in this country long when he made his decision to fight for the Confederacy. As a foreigner without citizenship, he was ineligible for the draft, so he volunteered. He was employed in Natchez, so it seems unlikely that he enlisted for the money. Many immigrants on both sides of the war were proud to fight for their new homeland and wanted others to see they considered themselves to be American or Southern or Mississippian. This was despite so many young men of military age coming over from Europe, specifically in order to avoid a draft on the other side of the Atlantic. There was also more pressure in the South for men to serve, with a greater need for soldiers and smaller populations, highlighting who opted to stay home. Also included in Simon Mayer's diary, Oscar Simon Levy was the son of John Mayer's brother, Joseph Levy, and a first cousin to both Simon Mayer and Simon Layman. He is sometimes misidentified as Simon Mayer's nephew. Another Bavarian native, Oscar had been in the US over 10 years when the war broke out. He enlisted with Simon Mayer in 1861 in the 1st Mississippi Infantry and then joined both Simons in the 10th Mississippi Infantry the following year. Levy spent most of his service detached to the Signal Corps, although he was back with his cousins for their parole. After the war, Oscar settled in San Francisco after, according to family, finding himself a very wealthy wife. During his time with the Signal Corps, Oscar and his company were sent up a hill before the Battle of Franklin by General John Bell Hood to observe troop movements. When the battle broke out, Oscar and his comrades found they were the only men with any cover, a single tree across the entire battlefield, and General Hood and his staff joined them there, protected by this timber. Over 40 years after the battle ended, Oscar was reunited with a friend from his signal company when they both read an article in the newspaper about that tree that saved their lives all those years ago, being turned into a cane as a gift for some prominent Nashville citizen. Oscar wrote to the editor of the newspaper to correct a description of the battle that day, and his friend saw Oscar's name and had the editor help him get in touch. The two reunited as old men, and it was covered nationally in the news. We have a much richer knowledge of Simon Mayer and his comrades and cousins' experience because of the diary Anna described. There are a number of extant diaries or published firsthand accounts from Jewish Confederate soldiers that help paint the clearest picture of what life was like for these men. There are a few examples of Union soldiers doing the same, but in much smaller numbers. Something about losing the war seems to have inspired Confederate veterans to want to share and tell their stories and justify their service in a way that Union veterans didn't feel was necessary. For Union men, they won the war and life returned to normal. And some used their military service to build better lives as veterans. The South kept the fight alive, though, and didn't move forward in the same way. While Mayer did not publish his diary during his lifetime, the experiences he had during the war were important enough that he felt the need to save the diary. His family continued to hold on to it and then donated the diary for it to be preserved in perpetuity. Okay, I'm going to hand you all over to Lizzie now so we can take some questions.
First, I want to thank Anna, Caitlin, and Alex for this wonderful presentation. I think it's so fantastic to be able to dive back into these histories and know that there's so much still to be uncovered and to hear these conversations. I saw a lot of questions coming in through the chat, and so I pulled out a few key themes that I saw, and now is also a fantastic opportunity to continue adding your questions to the chat. So one of the themes that I saw coming in through this chat was this idea of religious tolerance in the North and the South. And if there's any way that we can quantify or understand, was there more anti-Semitic feelings in the North or the South? What does that look like? I'm going to go ahead and stop my share so that we can see each other.
So I would say, so Alex and I don't think we made this quite clear. So our project, we are working on the Confederacy now. We are not done by any means. Like Alex said earlier, we have gone through South Carolina and Louisiana so far. We have a lot more states to cover. What I will say is that we have several well-documented accounts of anti-Semitism in the North. I don't think we have found any in the South yet. Alex, correct me if I'm wrong.
I think you're correct. I don't think we have any documented cases yet in the South. The records we're specifically looking at are mostly military records. So for the most part, it's not necessarily something that we would stumble upon in our day-to-day research of each soldier, but it's more in letters or diaries or extras that we look at where those stories become apparent. And I'm sure that as our research continues, we probably will also find some examples of this as we found in the North. I will say for the Union, and you can jump in here, Caitlin, and let me know what you think, but I think there are many less cases than we thought we would find.
For sure. For
the Union. We thought there would be a lot more well-documented cases of anti-Semitism, and we haven't seen as many as we thought.
For sure. You see a lot of soldiers serving together and kind of coming together and finding that camaraderie, and you like reading accounts after the war. Most Union veterans do not mention facing anti-Semitism, although we are confident it happened, but you don't see it a lot. And I will say in the South, there's a much higher percentage of Americans who are serving who are Jewish. And I think that helped a lot because they're a lot more integrated into the communities. They knew the other people they were serving with. These weren't strangers they met in a New York City, park where they were drilling for to go off to battle. So I have a feel like my impression is that it was a little less in terms in the South, just because you have a lot more familiarity and you're a lot less different than everyone else because you speak English, you're from the same town, that kind of thing.
And I'll point out, I think what's interesting is it's a fair amount of what documents and sources you're looking into. And, I certainly with Caitlin and Alex, they've done they're doing a very deep dive into if there are institutional instances of anti-Semitism. We do see more instances of anti-Semitism in some of the social circles that it was very much a conditional and complicated acceptance that many Jews had during this time period. And I think one of the things that Caitlin and Alex have described so eloquently is that there's ongoing immigration that was taking place throughout this time period. So there were also factors to consider about different languages, backgrounds, becoming parts of communities. So these are all layered together when we talk about anti-Semitism in the South. We do have significant instances of anti-Semitism in the colonial and antebellum periods. There's also, of course, General Orders number 11, which I think someone pointed out in the chat, which was an instance of General Grant's orders that took place in the South itself. But there are also instances after the Civil War. Samuel Fleischman, just a few years after the Civil War, was murdered after he was selling to recently emancipated African Americans. We also have instances that are more anecdotal, where people talk about exclusions from different clubs and organizations as well. So I think that even if there might be a trend toward less anti-Semitism, it's really important for us to pay attention to the fact that there was anti-Semitism, and it fluctuated from community to community and also over the course of an individual's life as well. So that's
absolutely.
I'll add to that.
Oh yeah, no, 110%. We are purely talking about what we're seeing in like military accounts. So yes, obviously anti-Semitism was something that these guys were facing. But we do see, like Alex and I were saying, we just see it less than expected, and we don't have documented accounts of specific like Civil War time incidents. But of course, Anna's totally right. This is something that these men had to face. So
thank you so much. And another theme that I saw pop up in the chat was that of Southern Jewish slave ownership. Is there a way to quantify Southern Jewish slave ownership? Were Southern Jewish people slave owners? Can we talk a little bit more about
Sure.
that?
So the short answer is yes. We have documented cases of Jewish slave ownership of our soldiers specifically in the South. As Caitlin mentioned, we have barely scratched the surface with the Confederacy thus far, and it is something that we just recently started tracking. So hopefully when our data becomes live and available to the public, for research, you hopefully will be able to see that in these soldiers' records. So different things that we look at specifically are the slave schedules that are on ancestry.com. Those are available and searchable online, and we do look at them for our soldiers' names, and we include them with their records if we can find proof of that. But again, it's something we haven't really been able to quantify yet with the numbers, but it is something that we're trying to track.
And I would support and very much looking forward to more and additional research like Alex and Caitlin are working on. With the museum, we went to several scholars with exactly this question. And one of the resources that we looked to is Jacob Rader Marcus analyzed approximately 129 Southern Jewish wills. So they were identified as both Southern and Jewish to see about the mention of enslaved individuals in a legalized document. And what he found was it was approximately 25%. Again, I say approximately, and this is a very small sample size of the population of Jewish individuals owned enslaved individuals. And this is roughly the same population as the general white population. And so what we're seeing are Jews in the American South during this time period had very much accepted and acculturated into the social norms of the broader white population. And we see that the practices, including ownership of enslaved individuals, followed along this general trend as well. But again, with Caitlin, much more research needs to be done and a lot more discussion and conversation about it as well.
Thank you. From somebody in the chat, do you plan to publish a book about your findings generally or separately about the Union and Confederate armies? And my guess is this is for our Shapell Roster folks.
So there is a book that was written by Adam Mendelson that is in the works that the foundation participated in, that the Roster Project participated in, that will be published by NYU Press, I think, in the next year. And he is also working on a Confederate book. It's not just based on our research, though, and we hope that more scholars will come to the Shapell Roster and use our research to write more books and come up with more theories and ideas, because we are adding data every day, documents, new soldiers. And so I think there's just a wealth of information on the topic that Alex and I don't have time to sit down and write a book about, but we really hope people will embrace what we've done and then do more of their own work and write more books, because we obviously love the topic. So
thank you. What was the spread of accounts, primary source of otherwise, across different socioeconomic backgrounds, if you have research into that? I'm curious. Somebody else in the chat is curious as well. And if not,
so wait, spread of accounts? Why am
I think it's like is there any way, what were the spread of
like socioeconomic backgrounds of the soldiers?
Yes, the counts of the soldiers. That's, I think, the word that, yeah.
So in the North, and again, we definitely can make more broad statements on the Union because we've just done more of the background work. But in the North, you have a lot of people who are enlisting because they need the money. A lot of like very fresh off the boat immigrants. As Alex mentioned earlier, only like 17% of our Union soldiers and sailors are American born thus far. You have a lot of very recent immigrants who come to this country and need jobs and end up in the military. So that happens a lot in the North. You have a lot of people who need the money, a lot of people who don't as well, but quite a bit of that. I would say in the South, you see a lot of wealthy families making sure their sons serve out of honor. You know, like that's very important to them, that they are seen as contributing to the cause and that their family is fighting. So I don't know, Alex, do you have?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, again, it's something that hopefully as we do more and more states and more data becomes available, we'll be able to speak to a little more. But our theories thus far are that it was more of a job up north, this is very general, and in the South, where you have all of these established families and communities, it was more, it was less about the money and more about your community and showing
until
up.
the draft starts, and then it's all
until the draft
a whole
starts.
other
Exactly.
issue.
Yeah. But definitely, I think we see people who are wealthier serve for the Confederacy. Now, that being said, we do have some wealthy families on both sides who we've seen who have so much money that they hire a substitute and they say, we're not going to serve. We have a few examples of this, like in Simon Wolf's roster. There is definitely a few soldiers that he lists that are in fact Jewish, but come to find out they didn't actually serve. They immediately hire someone else who shows up for them and enlists. We also have a few examples of soldiers that are Jewish that show up for a short period of time and then say, this isn't for me, I'm going home. And then they hire a substitute at that point. So that's another really interesting thing that we're also tracking. We track when a soldier hires a substitute, and then sometimes the occasion when they are hired as a substitute for someone else. We also track
have
that.
more guys who served as substitutes than guys who hired substitutes by far. So,
but it's something interesting that we're also tracking.
Fantastic. So always being mindful of the time. I'm going to thank our presenters today for your insight into this important topic. And I think more than anything, it shows that this is still a living conversation. And I'm super excited to see what conversations continue from here. And look forward to hopefully, talking with you again after more of the Confederate roster is up. And so we're so excited. And I also will say for everybody who's watching, who's really put my question, the good news is we're saving all of these questions. We'll keep them in our own archives, and they'll help inform future research. So keep abreast of what we're up to, because perhaps one of the questions you asked today will inspire us. I'm going to pop in a bunch of resources into the chat so you can continue following along with the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience and the Shapell Roster and all the work that's going on. And the last thing I'll say is the recording of this will be available in the next few weeks, maybe the next few days, we'll see. And you'll be able to catch this awesome on YouTube. So thank you all so much for being here. And I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Have a good night, y'all. And if you have a Civil War ancestor, reach out to us, roster@shapell.org. We would love to share and talk to you. So.
That's a good point. If you have a Civil War artifact, a Southern Jewish artifact, like a place for it to live, the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience might be the place for it. So thank you so much, y'all. Good night.